Good evening and welcome to Goodnight Flagstaff. My name is Amanda DeLano and I'm an actor with Theatricos Theatre Company. Thank you for tuning in to our community story time. You can find a new chapter from one of our favorite family-friendly books at 8 p.m. each weeknight on the Literacy Center's YouTube channel and on Crater Radio, a local online radio station. The previous chapter is replayed on Crater Radio each weeknight at about 7:30, just before the new chapter airs. You can also listen to all previous Goodnight Flagstaff recordings on YouTube. We are currently reading The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkein. If you'd like to check it out to read along with us at home, it is available at the library. Check one out today with your Coconino County Library card. Please email us if you'd like to join our team of readers and connect with your community through stories. All ages welcome. Our email is goodnightflagstaff@gmail.com. Last time we read together, the hobbits woke up in the prancing pony to find that Strider had been right. The Black Riders had come in the night and slashed the beds they were meant to sleep in. They also discovered all their ponies were missing, so Mr. Butterbur bought Bill the pony to help them on their journey. Strider led them along the road a ways and then through the forest and marshes. They walked for 7 days nearing Weathertop, where they hoped to find Gandalf. It was already midday when they drew near the southern end of the path, and saw before them in the pale clear light of the October sun a grey-green bank leading up like a bridge onto the northward slope of the hill. They decided to make for the top at once while the daylight was broad. Concealment was no longer possible, and they could only hope that no enemy or spy was observing them. Nothing was to be seen moving on the hill. If Gandalf was anywhere about, there was no sign of him. On the western flank of Weathertop they found a sheltered hollow, at the bottom of which there was a bowl-shaped dell with grassy sides. There they left Sam and Pippin with the pony and their packs and luggage. The other three went on. After half an hour's plodding climb, Strider reached the crown of the hill. Frodo and Merry followed, tired and breathless. The last slope had been steep and rocky. On the top they found, as Strider had said, a wide ring of ancient stonework, now crumbling or covered with age-long grass. But in the centre a cairn of broken stones had been piled. They were blackened as if with fire. About them the turf was burned to the roots, and all within the ring the grass was scorched and shriveled, as if flames had swept the hilltop, but there was no sign of any living thing. Standing upon the rim of the ruined circle, they saw all round below them a wide prospect, for the most part of lands empty and featureless, except for patches of woodland away to the south, beyond which they caught here and there the glint of distant water. Beneath them on this southern side there ran like a ribbon the old road, coming out of the west and winding up and down until it faded behind a ridge of dark land in the east. Nothing was moving on it. Following its line eastward with their eyes, they saw the mountains. The nearer foothills were brown and sombre. Behind them stood taller shapes of grey, and behind those again were high white peaks glimmering among the clouds. "Well, here we are," said Merry, "and very cheerless and uninviting it looks. There's no water and no shelter and no sign of Gandalf, but I don't blame him for not waiting, if he ever came here." "I wonder," said Strider, looking around thoughtfully. "Even if he was a day or two behind us at Bree, he could have arrived here first. He can ride very swiftly when need presses." Suddenly he stooped and looked at the stone on the top of the cairn. It was flatter than the others, and whiter, as if it had escaped the fire. He picked it up and examined it, turning it in his fingers. "This has been handled recently," he said. "What do you think of these marks?" On the flat underside, Frodo saw some scratches. "There seemed to be a stroke, a dot, and 3 more strokes," he said. "The stroke on the left might be a G rune with thin branches," said Strider. "It might be a sign left by Gandalf, though one cannot be sure. The scratches are fine, and they certainly look fresh, but the marks might mean something quite different and have nothing to do with us. Rangers use runes, and they come here sometimes." "What could they mean, even if Gandalf made them?" asked Merry. "I should say," answered Strider, "that they stood for G3, and were a sign that Gandalf was here on October the 3rd, and that is 3 days ago now. It would also show that he was in a hurry and danger was at hand, so that he had no time or did not dare to write anything longer or plainer. If that is so, we must be wary." "I wish we could feel sure that he made the marks, whatever they may mean," said Frodo. "It would be a great comfort to know that he was on the way in front of us or behind us." "Perhaps," said Strider. "For myself, I believe that he was here, and was in danger. There have been scorching flames here, and now the light that we saw 3 nights ago in the eastern sky comes back to my mind. I guess that he was attacked on this hilltop, but with what result I cannot tell. He is here no longer, and we must now look after ourselves and make our own way to Rivendell as best we can. How far is Rivendell? Asked Mary, gazing round warily. The world looked wild and wide from Weathertop. I don't know if the road has ever been measured in miles beyond the Forsaken Inn, a day's journey east of Bree, answered Strider. Some say it is so far, and some say otherwise. It is a strange road, and folk are glad to reach their journey's end, whether the time is short or long. But I know how long it would take me on my own feet, with fair weather and no ill fortune. 12 days from here to the ford of Brunin, where the road crosses the loud water that runs out of Rivendell. We have at least a fortnight's journey before us, for I do not think we shall be able to use the road. A fortnight, said Frodo. A lot may happen in that time. It may, said Strider. They stood for a while silent on the hilltop near its southward edge. In that lonely place, Frodo for the first time fully realized his homelessness and danger. He wished bitterly that his fortune had left him in the quiet and beloved Shire. He stared down at the hateful road, leading back westward to his home. Suddenly he was aware that 2 black specks were moving slowly along it, going westward, and looking again he saw that 3 others were creeping eastward to meet them. He gave a cry and clutched Strider's arm. Look, he said, pointing downwards. At once Strider flung himself on the ground behind the ruined circle, pulling Frodo down beside him. Merry threw himself alongside. What is it? He whispered. I do not know, but I fear the worst, answered Strider. Slowly they crawled up to the edge of the ring again and peered through a cleft between 2 jagged stones. The light was no longer bright, for the clear morning had faded, and clouds creeped out of the east, had now overtaken the sun. As it began to go down, they could all see the black specks, but neither Frodo nor Mary could make out their shapes for certain. Yet something told them that there, far below, were black riders assembling on the road beyond the foot of the hill. Yes, said Strider, whose keener sight left him in no doubt. The enemy is here. Hastily they crept away and slipped down the north side of the hill to their companions. Sam and Peregrine had not been idle. They had explored the small dell and the surrounding slopes. Not far away they found a spring of clear water in the hillside, and near it footprints not more than a day or 2 old. In the dell itself they found recent traces of a fire and some other signs of a hasty camp. There were some fallen rocks on the edge of the dell nearest to the hill. Behind them Sam came upon a small store of firewood neatly stacked. I wonder if old Gandalf has been here, he said to Pippin. Whoever it was put this stuff here meant to come back, it seems. Strider was greatly interested in these discoveries. I wish I had waited and explored the ground down here myself, he said, hurrying off to the spring to examine the footprints. It is just as I feared, he said when he came back. Sam and Pippin have trampled the soft ground, and the marks are spoilt or confused. Rangers have been here lately. It is they who left the firewood behind, but there are also several newer tracks that were not made by rangers. At least one set was made only a day or 2 ago by heavy boots. At least one. I cannot now be certain, but I think there were many booted feet. He paused and stood in anxious thought. Each of the hobbits saw in his mind a vision of the cloaked and booted riders. If the horsemen had already found the dell, the sooner Strider led them somewhere else the better. Sam viewed the hollow with great dislike, now that he had heard news of their enemies on the road, only a few miles away. Hadn't we better clear out quick, Mr. Strider? He asked impatiently. It is getting late, and I don't like this hold. It makes my heart sink somehow. Yes, we certainly must decide what to do at once, answered Strider, looking up and considering the time and the weather. Well, Sam, he said at last, I do not like this place either, but I cannot think of anywhere better that we could reach before nightfall. At least we are out of sight for the moment, and if we moved we should be much more likely to be seen by spies. All we could do would be to go right out of our way back north on this side of the line of hills, where the land is all much the same as it is here. The road is watched, but we should have to cross it if we tried to take cover in the thickets away to the south. On the north side of the road beyond the hills, the country is bare and flat for miles. Can the riders see? Asked Mary. I mean, they seem usually to have used their noses rather than their eyes, smelling for us. If smelling is the right word, at least in the daylight. But you made us lie down flat when you saw them down below, and now you talk of being seen if we move. I was too careless on the hilltop, answered Strider. I was very anxious to find some sign of Gandalf, but it was a mistake for 3 of us to go up and stand there so long. For the black horses can see, and the riders can use men and other creatures as spies, as we found at Bree. They themselves do not see the world of light as we do, but our shapes cast shadows in their minds, which only the noon sun destroys. And in the dark they perceive many signs and forms that are hidden from us. Then they are most to be feared. and at all times they smell the blood of living things, desiring and hating it. Senses, too. There are other than sight or smell. We can feel their presence. It troubled our hearts as soon as we came here, and before we saw them, they feel ours more keenly. Also, he added, and his voice sank to a whisper, the ring draws them. Is there no escape, then? Said Frodo, looking round wildly. If I move, I shall be seen and hunted. If I stay, I shall draw them to me. Strider laid his hand on his shoulder. There is still hope, he said. You are not alone. Let us take this wood that is set ready for the fire as a sign. There is little shelter or defence here, but fire shall serve for both. Sauron could put fire to his evil uses as he can all things, but these riders do not love it, and fear those who wield it. Fire is our friend in the wilderness. Maybe, answered Sam. It is also as good a way of saying, here we are, as I can think of, while shouting. Down in the lowest and most sheltered corner of the dell they lit a fire and prepared a meal. The shades of evening began to fall, and it grew cold. They were suddenly aware of great hunger, for they had not eaten anything since breakfast, but they dared not make more than a frugal supper. Their lands ahead were empty of all save birds and beasts, unfriendly places deserted by all the races of the world. Rangers passed at times beyond the hills, but they were few and did not stay. Other wanderers were rare, and of evil sort. Trolls might stray down at times out of the northern valleys of the misty mountains. Only on the road would travellers be found, most often dwarves, hurrying along on business of their own, and with no help and few words to spare for strangers. I don't see how food can be made to last, said Frodo. We have been careful enough in the last few days, and the supper is no feast, but we have used more than we ought. We have 2 weeks still to go, and perhaps more. There is food in the wild, said Strider. Berry, root, and herb, and I have some skill as a hunter at need. You need not be afraid of starving before winter comes. But gathering and catching food is long and weary work, and we need haste. So tighten your belts and think with hope of the tables of Elrond's house. The cold increased as darkness came on. Peering out of the edge of the dell, they could see nothing but grey land now vanishing quickly into shadow. The sky above had cleared again and was slowly filled with twinkling stars. Frodo and his companions huddled round the fire, wrapped in every garment and blanket they possessed, but Strider was content with a single cloak, and sat a little apart, drawing thoughtfully at his pipe. As night fell and the light of the fire began to shine out brightly, he began to tell them tales to keep their minds from fear. He knew many histories and legends of long ago, of elves and men and the good and evil deeds of the elder days. They wondered how old he was, and where he had learned all this lore. Tell us of Gil-galad, said Merry suddenly, when he paused at the end of the story of the elf kingdoms. Do you know any more of that old lay that you spoke of? I do indeed, answered Strider. So also does Frodo, for it concerns us closely. Merry and Pippin looked at Frodo, who was staring into the fire. I only know the little that Gandalf has told me, said Frodo slowly. Gil-galad was the last of the great elf kings of Middle-earth. Gil-galad is starlight in their tongue. With Elendil, the elf friend, he went to the land of— No, said Strider, interrupting. I do not think that tale should be told now with the servant of the enemy at hand. If we win through to the house of Elrond, you may hear it there, told in full. Then tell us some other tale of the old days, begged Sam. A tale about the elves before the fading time. I would dearly like to hear more about elves. The dark seems to press round so close. I will tell you the tale of Tinuviel, said Strider. In brief, for it is a long tale for which the end is not known, and there are none now except Elrond that remember it aright as it was told of old. It is a fair tale, though it is sad, as are all the tales of Middle-earth, and yet it may lift up your hearts. He was silent for some time, and then he began not to speak, but to chant softly. The leaves were long, the grass was green, and hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen of stars and shadows shimmering. Tinuviel was dancing there in music of a pipe unseen, and light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. There Beren came from mountains cold, and lost he wandered under leaves, and where the elven river rolled, he walked alone and sorrowing. He peered between the hemlock leaves and saw in wonder flowers of gold upon her mantle and her sleeves, and her hair like shadow following. Enchantment healed his weary feet that over hills were doomed to roam, and forth he hastened strong and fleet, and grasped at moonbeams glistening. Through woven woods and elven homes she lightly fled on dancing feet, and left him lonely still to roam in the silent forest listening. He heard there oft the flying sound of feet as light as linden leaves, or music welling underground in hidden hollows quavering. Now withered lay the hemlock sheaves, and one by one with sighing sound whispering fell the beechen leaves, and the wintry woodland wavering. He sought her ever wandering far, where leaves of years were thickly strewn by light of moon and ray of star, and frosty heaven shivering. Her mantle glinted in the moon as on a hilltop high and far. She danced, and at her feet was strewn a mist of silver quivering. When winter passed she came again, and her song released the sudden spring, like rising lark and falling rain and melting water bubbling. He saw the elven flowers spring about her feet and healed again. He longed by her to dance and sing upon the grass untroubling. Again she fled, but swift he came to Nuviel, to Nuviel. He called her by her elvish name, and there she halted listening. One moment stood she, and a spell his voice laid on her barren came, and doom fell on to Nuviel that in his arms lay glistening. As Baron looked into her eyes, within the shadows of her hair, the trembling starlight of the skies, he saw their mirrored shimmering. To Nuviel the elven fair, immortal maid, elven wise, about him cast her shadowy hair, and arms like silver glimmering. Long was the way that fate them bore, o'er stony mountains cold and dark, through halls of iron and darkling door, and woods of nightshade marrowless. The sundering seas between them lay, and yet at last they met once more, and long ago they passed away in the forest singing sorrowless. Strider sighed and paused before he spoke again. "That is a song," he said, "in the mode that is called anthenath among the elves, but is hard to render in our common speech, and is but a rough echo of it. It tells of the meeting of Beren, son of Barahir, and Luthien to Nuviel. Beren was a mortal man, but Luthien was the daughter of Thingol, king of elves upon Middle-earth, when the world was young, and she was the fairest maiden that has ever been among the children of this world. As the stars above the mists of the northern lands was her loveliness, and in her face was a shining light. In those days the great enemy, of whom Sauron of Mordor was but a servant, dwelt in Angband in the north, and the elves of the west, coming back to Middle-earth, made war upon him to regain the Silmarils which he had stolen, and the fathers of men aided the elves. But the enemy was victorious, and Barahir was slain, and Beren, escaping through great peril, came over the mountains of terror into the hidden kingdom of Thingol in the forest of Neldereth. There he beheld Luthien singing and dancing in a glade beside the enchanted river Escaldwine, and he named her to Nuviel, that is nightingale in the language of old. Many sorrows befell them afterwards, and they were parted long. Tinuviel rescued Beren from the dungeons of Sauron, and together they passed through great dangers and cast down even the great enemy from his throne, and took from his iron crown one of the 3 Silmarils, brightest of all jewels, to be the bride-piece of Luthien and to Thingol her father. Yet at the last Beren was slain by the wolf that came from the gates of Angband, and he died in the arms of Tinuviel. But she chose mortality, and to die from the world so that she might follow him, and it is sung that they met again beyond the sundering seas, and after a brief time, walking alive once more in the green woods, together they passed, long ago, beyond the confines of this world. So it is that Luthien Tinuviel, alone of the elf kindred, has died indeed and left the world, and they have lost her whom they most loved. But from her lineage of the elf lords of old descended among men, there live still those of whom Luthien was the foremother, and it is said that her line shall never fail. Elrond of Rivendell is of that kin, for of Beren and Luthien was born J.R.R Thingol's heir, and of him Elwing the White, whom Erendil wedded, he that sailed his ship out of the mists of the world into the seas of heaven with the Silmaril upon its brow. And of Erendil came the kings of Númenor, that is Westernesse. As Strider was speaking, they watched his strange, eager face, dimly lit in the red glow of the wood fire. His eyes shone, and his voice was rich and deep. Above him was a black, starry sky. Suddenly a pale light appeared over the crown of Weathertop behind him. The waxing moon was climbing slowly above the hill that overshadowed them, and the stars above the hilltop faded. The story ended. The hobbits moved and stretched. "Look," said Merry, "the moon is rising. It must be getting late." The others looked up. Even as they did so, they saw on the top of the hill something small and dark against the glimmer of the moonrise. It was perhaps only a large stone or jutting rock shown up by the pale light. Sam and Merry got up and walked away from the fire. Frodo and Pippin remained seated in silence. Strider was watching the moonlight on the hill intently. All seemed quiet and still, but Frodo felt a cold dread creeping over his heart now that Strider was no longer speaking. He huddled closer to the fire. At that moment Sam came running back from the edge of the dell. "Oh, I don't know what it is," he said, "but I've suddenly felt afraid. I daren't go outside this dell for any money. I felt that something was creeping up the slope." "Did you see anything?" said Frodo, springing to his feet. "No, sir, I saw nothing, but I didn't stop to look." "I saw something," said Merry, "or I thought I did. Away westwards, where the moonlight was falling on the flats beyond the shadow of the hilltops, I thought there were 2 or 3 black shapes. They seemed to be moving this way." "Keep close to the fire with your faces outward," cried Strider. "Get some of the longer sticks ready in your hands." For a breathless time they sat there silent and alert with their backs turned to the wood fire, each gazing into the shadows that encircled them. Nothing happened. There was no sound or movement in the night. Frodo stood, feeling that he must break the silence. He longed to shout out aloud. "Hush!" whispered Strider. "What's that?" gasped Pippin at the same moment. Over the lip of the little dell on their side away from the hill, they felt rather than saw a shadow rise. One shadow, or more than one. They strained their eyes, and the shadows seemed to grow. Soon there could be no doubt. 3 or 4 tall black figures were standing there on the slope, looking down on them. So black were they that they seemed like black holes in the deep shade behind them. Frodo thought he had heard a faint hiss as of venomous breath, and felt a thin, piercing chill. Then the shapes slowly advanced. Terror overcame Pippin and Merry, and they threw themselves flat on the ground. Sam shrank to Frodo's side. Frodo was hardly less terrified than his companions. He was quaking as if he was bitter cold, but his terror was swallowed up in a sudden temptation to put on the ring. The desire to do this laid hold of him, and he could think of nothing else. He did not forget the barrow, nor the message of Gandalf, but something seemed to be compelling him to disregard all warnings, and he longed to yield. Not with the hope of escape or of doing anything, either good or bad. He simply felt that he must take the ring and put it on his finger. He could not speak. He felt Sam looking at him as if he knew that his master was in some great trouble, but he could not turn towards him. He shut his eyes and struggled for a while, but resistance became unbearable, and at last he slowly drew out the chain and slipped the ring on the forefinger of his left hand. Immediately, though everything else remained as before, dim and dark, the shapes became terribly clear. He was able to see beneath their black wrappings. There were 5 tall figures, 2 standing on the lip of the dell, 3 advancing. In their white faces burned keen and merciless eyes. Under their mantles were long grey robes. Upon their grey hairs were helms of silver. In their haggard hands were swords of steel. Their eyes fell on him and pierced him as they rushed towards him. Desperate, he drew his own sword, and it seemed to him that it flickered red, as if it were a firebrand. Two of the figures halted. The third was taller than the others. His hair was long and gleaming, and on his helm was a crown. In one hand he held a long sword, and in the other a knife. Both the knife and the hand that held it glowed with a pale light. He sprang forward and bore down on Frodo. At that moment Frodo threw himself forward on the ground, and he heard himself crying aloud, "O Elbereth, Gilthoniel!" At the same time he struck at the feet of his enemy. A shrill cry rang out in the night, and he felt a pain like a dart of poisoned ice pierce his left shoulder. Even as he swooned, he caught, as through a swirling mist, a glimpse of Strider leaping out of the darkness with a flaming brand of wood in either hand. With a last effort, Frodo, dropping his sword, slipped a ring from his finger and closed his right hand tight upon it. Thank you for tuning in. Join us next time as we read the first half of Chapter 12 of the Fellowship of the Ring. Good night, Flagstaff.